The short stories of Anton Chekhov. Story Kashtanka. 6. An uneasy night. Auntie had a doggy dream that a porter ran after her with a broom and she woke up in a fright. It was quite dark and very stuffy in the room. The fleas were biting. Auntie had never been afraid of the darkness before, but now, for some reason, she felt frightened and inclined to bark. Her master heaved a loud sigh in the next room. Then, soon afterwards, the saw grunted in her sty. And then all was still again. When one thinks about eating, one's heart grows lighter, and Auntie began thinking how that day she had stolen the leg of the chicken from Fyodor Timofeyich and had hidden it in the drawing room between the cupboard and the wall, where there were a great many spiders' webs and a great deal of dust. Would it not be as well to go now and look whether the chicken leg were still there or not? It was very possible that her master had found it and eaten it, but she must not go out of the room before morning. That was the rule. Auntie shut her eyes to go to sleep as quickly as possible, for she knew by experience that the sooner you go to sleep, the sooner the morning comes. But all at once there was a strange scream not far from her, which made her start and jump on all four legs. It was Ivan Ivanovich, and his cry was not babbling and persuasive as usual, but a wild, shrill, unnatural scream, like the squeak of a door opening. Unable to distinguish anything in the darkness and not understanding what was wrong, Auntie felt still more frightened and growled. Some time passed, as long as it takes to eat a good bone. The scream was not repeated. Little by little, Auntie's uneasiness passed off and she began to doze off. She dreamed of two big black dogs with tufts of last year's coat left on their haunches and sides. They were eating out of a big basin, some swill, from which there came a white steam and a most appetizing smell. From time to time they looked round at Auntie, showed their teeth, and growled, "We are not going to give you any." But a peasant in a fur coat ran out of the house and drove them away with a whip. Then Auntie went up to the basin and began eating. But as soon as the peasant went out of the gate, the two black dogs rushed at her, growling, and all at once there was again a shrill scream. "Kagi, kagi, gee!" cried Ivan Ivanovich. Auntie woke up, jumped up, and, without leaving her mattress, went off into a yelping bark. It seemed to her that it was not Ivan Ivanovich that was screaming, but someone else, and for some reason the saw again grunted in her sty. Then there was the sound of shuffling slippers, and the master came into the room in his dressing gown, with a candle in his hand. The flickering light danced over the dirty wallpaper and the ceiling, and chased away the darkness. Auntie saw that there was no stranger in the room. Ivan Ivanovich was sitting on the floor and was not asleep. His wings were spread out and his beak was open, and altogether he looked as though he were very tired and thirsty. Old Fyodor Timofeyich was not asleep either. He too must have been awakened by the scream. "Ivan Ivanovich, what's the matter with you?" the master asked the gander. "Why are you screaming? Are you ill?" The gander did not answer. The master touched him on the neck, stroked his back, and said, "You are a queer chap. You don't sleep yourself, and you don't let other people. When the master went out, carrying the candle with him, there was darkness again. Auntie felt frightened. The gander did not scream, but again she fancied that there was some stranger in the room. What was most dreadful was that this stranger could not be bitten, as he was unseen and had no shape. And for some reason, she thought that something very bad would certainly happen that night. Fyodor Timofeyevich was uneasy too. Auntie could hear him shifting on his mattress, yawning and shaking his head. Somewhere in the street there was a knocking at the gate, and the saw grunted in her sty. Auntie began to whine, stretched out her front paws, and laid her head down upon them. She fancied that in the knocking at the gate, in the grunting of the saw, who was for some reason awake in the darkness and the stillness, there was something as miserable and dreadful as in Ivan Ivanovich's scream. Everything was in agitation and anxiety. But why? Who was the stranger who could not be seen? Then two dim flashes of green gleamed for a minute near Auntie. It was Fyodor Timofeyevich, for the first time of their whole acquaintance, coming up to her. What did he want? Auntie licked his paws and, not asking why he had come, howled softly and on various notes. Kigi! Cried Ivan Ivanovich. Kigi! The door opened again and the master came in with a candle. The gander was sitting in the same attitude as before. With his beak open and his wings spread out, his eyes were closed. Ivan Ivanovich, his master, called him. The gander did not stir. His master sat down before him on the floor, looked at him in silence for a minute, and then said, Ivan Ivanovich, what is it? Are you dying? Oh, I remember now, I remember. He cried out and clutched his head. I know why it is. It's because the horse stepped on you today. My God, my God. Auntie did not understand what her master was saying, but she saw from his face that he, too, was expecting something dreadful. She stretched out her head towards the dark window, where it seemed to her some stranger was looking in, and howled. He is dying, Auntie, said the master, and wrung his hands. Yes, yes, he is dying. Death has come into your room. What are we to do? Pale and agitated, the master went back into his room, sighing and shaking his head. Auntie was afraid to remain in the darkness and followed her master into the bedroom. He sat down on the bed and repeated several times, My God, what's to be done? Auntie walked about round his feet and, not understanding why she was wretched and why they were all so uneasy, and trying to understand, watched every movement he made. Fyodor Timofeyevich, who rarely left his little mattress, came into the master's bedroom too and began rubbing himself against his feet. He shook his head as though he wanted to shake painful thoughts out of it and kept peeping suspiciously under the bed. The master took a saucer, poured some water from his washstand into it, and went to the gander again. Drink, Ivan Ivanovich, he said tenderly, setting the saucer before him. Drink, darling. But Ivan Ivanovich did not stir and did not open his eyes. His master bent his head down to the saucer and dipped his beak into the water, but the gander did not drink. He spread his wings wider than ever, and his head remained lying in the saucer. No, there's nothing to be done now, sighed the master. It's all over. Ivan Ivanovich is gone, and shining drops, such as one sees on the window pane when it rains, trickled down his cheeks. not understanding what was the matter. Auntie and Fyodor Timofeyevich snuggled up to him and looked with horror at the gander. Poor Ivan Ivanovich, said the master, sighing mournfully. And I was dreaming I would take you in the spring into the country and would walk with you on the green grass. Dear creature, my good comrade, you are no more. How shall I do without you now? It seemed to Auntie that the same thing would happen to her, that is, that she too, there was no knowing why, would close her eyes, stretch out her paws, open her mouth, and everyone would look at her with horror. Apparently, the same reflections were passing through the brain of Fyodor Timofeyevich. Never before had the old cat been so morose and gloomy. It began to get light, and the unseen stranger who had so frightened Auntie was no longer in the room. When it was quite daylight, the porter came in, took the gander, and carried him away. And soon afterwards, the old woman came in and took away the trough. Auntie went into the drawing room and looked behind the cupboard. Her master had not eaten the chicken bone. It was lying in its place among the dust and the spiders' webs. But Auntie felt sad and dreary and wanted to cry. She did not even sniff at the bone, but went under the sofa, sat down there, and began softly whining in a thin voice. 7. An unsuccessful debut. One fine evening, the master came into the room with the dirty wallpaper and rubbing his hands said, "Well." He meant to say something more but went away without saying it. Auntie, who during her lessons had thoroughly studied his face and intonations, divined that he was agitated, anxious, and she fancied angry. Soon afterwards he came back and said, "Today I shall take with me Auntie and Fyodor Timofeyevich. Today, Auntie, you will take the place of poor Ivan Ivanovich in the Egyptian pyramid. Goodness knows how it will be. Nothing is ready. Nothing has been thoroughly studied. There have been few rehearsals. We shall be disgraced. We shall come to grief." Then he went out again and a minute later came back in his fur coat and top hat. Going up to the cat, he took him by the forepaws and put him inside the front of his coat, while Fyodor Timofeyevich appeared completely unconcerned and did not even trouble to open his eyes. To him, it was apparently a matter of absolute indifference whether he remained lying down or were lifted up by his paws, whether he rested on his mattress or under his master's fur coat. "Come along, Auntie," said her master. Wagging her tail and understanding nothing, Auntie followed him. A minute later she was sitting in a sledge by her master's feet and heard him, shrinking with cold and anxiety, mutter to himself, "We shall be disgraced. We shall come to grief." The sledge stopped at a big strange-looking house like a soup ladle, turned upside down. The long entrance to this house, with its 3 glass doors, was lighted up with a dozen brilliant lamps. The doors opened with a resounding noise and, like jaws, swallowed up the people who were moving to and fro at the entrance. There were a great many people, horses too, often ran up to the entrance, but no dogs were to be seen. The master took Auntie in his arms and thrust her in his coat where Fyodor Timofeyevich already was. It was dark and stuffy there, but warm. For an instant, 2 green sparks flashed at her. It was the cat who opened his eyes on being disturbed by his neighbor's cold, rough paws. Auntie licked his ears and, trying to settle herself as comfortably as possible, moved uneasily, crushed him under her cold paws, and casually poked her head out from under the coat, but at once growled angrily and tucked it in again. It seemed to her that she had seen a huge, badly lighted room full of monsters from behind screens and gratings, which stretched on both sides of the room. Horrible faces looked out, faces of horses with horns, with long ears, and one fat, huge countenance with a tail instead of a nose, and two long, gnawed bones sticking out of his mouth. The cat mewed huskily under Auntie's paws, but at that moment the coat was flung open. The master said, "Hop," and Fyodor Timofeyevich and Auntie jumped to the floor. They were now in a little room with grey plank walls. There was no other furniture in it but a little table with a looking glass on it, and a stool, and some rags hung about the corners. And instead of a lamp or candles, there was a bright fan shaped light attached to a little pipe fixed in the wall. Fyodor Timofeyevich licked his coat with which had been ruffled by Auntie, went under the stool and lay down. Their master, still agitated and rubbing his hands, began undressing. He undressed as he usually did at home when he was preparing to get under the rug. That is, took off everything but his underlinen. Then he sat down on the stool and, looking in the looking glass, began playing the most surprising tricks with himself. First of all, he put on his head a wig with a parting and with two tufts of hair standing up like horns. Then he smeared his face thickly with something white, and over the white color painted his eyebrows, his mustaches, and red on his cheeks. His antics did not end with that. After smearing his face and neck, he began putting himself into an extraordinary and incongruous costume, such as Auntie had never seen before, either in houses or in the street. Imagine very full trousers made of chintz covered with big flowers, such as is used in working class houses for curtains and covering furniture. Trousers which buttoned up just under the armpits. One trouser leg was made of brown chintz and the other bright yellow. Almost lost in these, he then put on a short chintz jacket with a big scalloped collar and a gold star on the back, stocking of different colors, and green slippers. Everything seemed going round before Auntie's eyes and in her soul. The white-faced, sack-like figure smelt like her master. Its voice, too, was the familiar master's voice, but there were moments when Auntie was tortured by doubts, and then she was ready to run away from the party-colored figure and to bark. The new place, the fan-shaped light, the smell, the transformation that had taken place in her master, all this aroused in her a vague dread and a foreboding that she would certainly meet with some horror, such as the big face with the tail instead of a nose. And then, somewhere through the wall, some hateful band was playing, and from time to time she heard an incomprehensible roar. Only one thing reassured her. That was the imperturbability of Fyodor Timofeyevich. He dozed with the utmost tranquillity under the stool and did not open his eyes even when it was moved. A man in a dress coat and a white waistcoat peeped into the little room and said, "Miss Arabella has just gone on. After her, you." Their master made no answer. He drew a small box from under the table, sat down and waited. From his lips and his hands it could be seen that he was agitated, and Auntie could hear how his breathing came in gasps. Monseigneur George, come on, someone shouted behind the door. Their master got up and crossed himself 3 times. Then took the cat from under the stool and put him in the box. Come, Auntie, he said softly. Auntie, who could make nothing out of it, went up to his hands. He kissed her on the head and put her beside Fyodor Timofeyevich. Then followed darkness. Auntie trampled on the cat, scratched at the walls of the box, and was so frightened that she could not utter a sound, while the box swayed and quivered, as though it were on the waves. Here we are again, her master shouted aloud. Here we are again. Auntie felt that after that shout the box struck against something hard and left off swaying. There was a loud, deep roar. Someone was being slapped, and that someone, probably the monster with the tail instead of a nose, roared and laughed so loud that the locks of the box trembled. In response to the roar, there came a shrill, squeaky laugh from her master, such as he had never laughed at home. Ha! He shouted, trying to shout above the roar. Honored friends, I have only just come from the station. My grannies kicked the bucket and left me a fortune. There is something very heavy in the box. It must be gold. I bet there's 1,000,000 here. We'll open it and look. The lock of the box clicked. The bright light dazzled Auntie's eyes. She jumped out of the box and, deafened by the roar, ran quickly round her master and broke into a shrill bark. Ha! Exclaimed the master. Uncle Fyodor Timofeyevich, beloved aunt, dear relations, the devil take you. He fell on his stomach on the sand, seized the cat and Auntie, and fell to embracing them. While he held Auntie tight in his arms, she glanced round in the world into which fate had brought her, and impressed by its immensity, was for a minute dumbfounded with amazement and delight, then jumped out of her master's arms, and to express the intensity of her emotions, whirled round and round on one spot like a top. This new world was big and full of bright light. Wherever she looked, on all sides, from floor to the ceiling, there were faces, 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 and nothing else. Auntie, I beg you to sit down, shouted her master. Remembering what that meant, Auntie jumped onto a chair and sat down. She looked at her master. His eyes looked at her gravely and kindly as always, but his face, especially his mouth and teeth, were made grotesque by a broad, immovable grin. He laughed, skipped about, twitched his shoulders, and made a show of being very merry in the presence of the thousands of faces. Auntie believed in his merriment all at once, felt all over her that those thousands of faces were looking at her, lifted up her fox-like head, and howled joyously. You sit there, Auntie, her master said to her, while Uncle and I will dance the Kamarinsky. Fyodor Timofeyevich stood, looking about him indifferently, waiting to be made to do something silly. He danced listlessly, carelessly, sullenly, and one could see from his movements, his tail and his ears, that he had a profound contempt for the crowd, the bright light, his master and himself. When he had performed his allotted task, he gave a yawn and sat down. Now, Auntie, said her master, We'll have first a song and then a dance, shall we? He took out a pipe out of his pocket and began playing. Auntie, who could not endure the music, began moving uneasily in her chair and howled. A roar of applause rose from all sides. Her master bowed and, when all was still again, went on playing. Just as he took one very high note, someone high up among the audience uttered a loud exclamation. Auntie cried a child's voice. Why, it's Kashtanka! Kashtanka it is, declared a cracked, drunken tenor. Kashtanka, strike me dead. It is Kashtanka, Kashtanka here. Someone in the gallery gave a whistle and two voices, one a boy's and one a man's, called loudly, Kashtanka, Kashtanka. Auntie started and looked where the shouting came from. Two faces, one hairy, drunken and grinning, the other chubby, rosy-cheeked and frightened looking, dazed her eyes as the bright light had dazed them before. She remembered, fell off the chair, struggled on the sand, then jumped up and with a delighted yap dashed towards those faces. There was a deafening roar, interspersed with whistles and a shrill childish shout. Kashtanka! Kashtanka! Auntie leaped over the barrier, then across someone's shoulders. She found herself in a box. To get into the next tier, she had to leap over a high wall. Auntie jumped, but did not jump high enough and slipped back down the wall. Then she passed from hand to hand, licked hands and faces, kept mounting higher and higher, and at last got into the gallery. Half an hour afterwards, Kashtanka was in the street following the people who smelt of glue and varnish. Luka Alexandrych, staggered and instinctively taught by experience, tried to keep as far from the gutter as possible. In sin my mother bore me, he muttered, and you, Kashtanka, are a thing of little understanding. Beside a man, you are like a joiner beside a cabinet maker. Fedorushka walked beside him, wearing his father's cap. Kashtanka looked at their backs, and it seemed to her that she had been following them for ages and was glad that there had not been a break for a minute in her life. She remembered the little room with dirty wallpaper, the gander, Fyodor Timofeyevich, the delicious dinners, the lessons, the circus, but all that seemed to her now like a long, tangled, oppressive dream.